Recently, though, Health Canada made the decision to approve a physician's application under the Special Access Program to give heroin to heroin addicts. Not to treat an underlying medical condition, but simply to allow them to continue to have access to heroin for their addiction. These drugs, as Dr. Saldana said, can tear families apart, lead to criminal behavior, and literally destroy lives.
That was Rona Ambrose, health minister, last fall. But apparently this prescription heroin story is not going away, particularly in BC. So Paige McPherson, just fresh back from BC, really.
Yes, I am.
Has that story. You better give us a little bit more of the backstory. It's not something that's been in the news for a while.
Sure. So right now in the Supreme Court, there is basically a select few number of addicts, heroin addicts. There's 5 of them, being represented by a lawyer who says that their charter rights are being infringed upon by Rona Ambrose and the federal government, who are saying, as she sort of said there, that heroin should not be prescribed in Canada. Basically, that's the federal government's position. This lawyer representing these addicts, and as well as a number of doctors from BC who also say this, is that we should allow heroin to be prescribed to addicts in sort of a similar way that nicotine would help somebody wean off cigarettes with nicotine patches or something like that. Heroin can be used in the same way. It's following 2 studies that have been done. The first comparing heroin use to methadone use, which is commonly prescribed to heroin addicts to get them off of the drug. The second one comparing it to another painkiller, hydromorphone, to heroin. Both studies, apparently, according to these doctors, found that heroin was more effective in weaning people off the drugs and more effective in generally, I think there's a harm reduction approach there too, saying if they do it there, they're not going to be doing it on the streets.
Yeah, I don't buy the harm reduction thing, but I do get these studies. This is the North American Opiate Medication Initiative, right? That looked at this and they said that they people that were in this treatment experience more physical and mental health improvements, more likely to stay in treatment as well, and reduce illegal drug use and then the attendant criminal activity that goes along with that.
Right.
That all sounds good to me, the evidence.
Yeah, definitely. And that's sort of what the BC doctors are saying, is that, the evidence is behind this in terms of people staying in treatment, as you say. That's sort of where I think the harm reduction element comes in. It sort of is a big thing in BC, harm reduction, I think generally in BC, a bigger thing than it is in the rest of Canada, as in if people are going to do heroin, obviously we see places like Insight, let's let them do it in a safe environment instead of on the streets. That's one of the arguments that's being made by the lawyer here, who's saying that these people's security of person charter rights are being infringed upon. Also saying that the federal government is basically stepping on the toes of the provincial government here when it comes to their jurisdiction over health. But also just the point that you made, that they're going to stay in treatment, that they're going to wean off of the drug. Effectively, 21 people sort of slipped through the system before Health Canada, or before the federal government cracked down on it, and were approved for heroin use. They're not currently using heroin because the government has said, no, we're going to bar heroin, cocaine, and ecstasy from ever being prescribed in Canada.
Yeah, and LSD was on that list too.
Right.
So those 21 were approved, but they're still not getting the drugs under the program because Rona Ambrose shut it down. But Health Canada had approved all this.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yes, this is something that Health Canada did approve, basically saying that, like any other drug, heroin used to be prescribed in Canada in hospitals as a painkiller. And a lot of people, saying that it's kind of arbitrary, that the drugs that Health Canada or the government are allowed to provide to people in terms of opiates, painkillers in hospitals, it's sort of arbitrary. And some of the drugs that have perhaps become popular on the street, such as heroin, we should ban, or that's what the federal government thinks, but others saying, well, that's an arbitrary decision. There's nothing more harmful about prescription level heroin than there is about, let's say, prescription level OxyContin, which of course we also know is a big...
Is abused.
Yeah, it is abused, and there are a lot of people that are addicted to that in many parts of Canada.
So what you're suggesting is this is a political story, people trying to crack down on illegal use of heroin, versus a medical story where people are trying to be treated. Is that the bottom line?
I think so. I think that the federal government, we know that our federal government takes a very hard on drugs stance. And I think that a lot of people in Canada...
Which is a good thing.
I think in a lot of cases, yes, and a lot of people in Canada would say that the federal government should continue to crack down on drugs, continue to be hard on this specific issue. When it comes to this, people hearing that heroin is prescribed in hospitals, especially to people who are already addicted to heroin, Rona Ambrose says, we're not going to accept this throwaway society. We're not just going to say that because these people are already addicted to heroin, we should just keep giving them heroin and that's what their addiction should be. The reality is in Canada we have a lot of drug recovery centers that really do that kind of harm reduction approach, or not that harm reduction approach, but sort of wean people off. Don't use that cold turkey approach.
It's a treatment approach, not a harm reduction. There's a difference between the two of them.
Right. So I mean, but instead of cold turkey, I guess is what I'm saying.
Right.
So instead of saying no, we're not going to do any drugs, which kind of I think would be more in line with the federal government's position, saying we're going to sort of wean you off of it, and then advocates are saying, well, this is just another way that we can do that, and the federal government is saying absolutely not. We're not going to give addicts more heroin. We're not going to continue to feed their addiction, of course, with tax dollars. That's another issue here as well.
Good point. But all medical care is
of course
with tax dollars. It's
exactly
just the way it works. Okay, so now it's gone to the Supreme Court. When do we expect the ruling?
Unsure about that. I mean, this has been something that's been obviously an issue since the fall, coming back into the news now as we are sort of hearing arguments. And yeah, I don't know. I think though it could be a very, obviously a groundbreaking case in terms of, are we going to allow doctors to prescribe heroin again? And a lot of people are really concerned about the fact that this could feed addictions, could, perpetuate problems. When you take a drug like OxyContin, for example, that's a legally prescribed drug. It's not technically legal, obviously, to use it if you don't have a prescription, but it is so much easier. I think people would say perhaps that it's easier to get access to a drug if it is legally prescribed. I think that's a big issue when it comes to heroin. And I think that there's also an optics issue. If you have the government prescribing a drug that is bad for you, obviously the federal government here saying this is a life-ruining drug. It ruins people's lives, it destroys people's families, which I don't think anybody would argue that heroin does do that. And so I think that there's an optics issue. If the government says, yes, we're going to prescribe it to you, it's fine to use. It's sort of similar to the medical marijuana argument, right? I mean, if the government says, well, this is okay, then people might think, well, maybe it isn't that unsafe then. Maybe, a lot of the deterrents that keep people off of heroin on the street, maybe they're going to think, well, maybe it is okay.
And it could be said of almost any drug. I mean, there are people out there that think that aspirin is, the killer drug out there overall. So it's up to interpretation. It throws it back into the medical field, to the doctor. The doctor has to prescribe it.
Right.
And it's up to the doctors' associations to monitor what doctors are abusing that privilege.
Right, exactly.
But all part of the same story. Paige, thanks so much.
Thank you.
We'll look forward to that ruling. Paige McPherson joining us, Sun News contributor.